With the release of the new DLC for Total War Warhammer 3, Creative Assembly have once again tasked me with recreating one of the new units from Omens of Destruction in miniature form. Now, while there are plenty of options across the three factions focused on in this new content, I ultimately settled on one unit that never received an official tabletop model, the Beast of Khorne. Now, these Khornate monstrosities have gone by many names: Blood Beast, Blood Spawn, or Monstrous Ones, just to name a few, and their forms are just as numerous. However, the Blood Beasts are nearly always masses of muscle and tendons whose limbs and tails are often armoured or scaled and end with deadly mutated weapons. Combined with the game's interpretation of the beast, this gave me some direction, but also left the door open for plenty of interpretation, which led me towards using the Wilderfiend from the Slaves to Darkness range. This creature is large and roughly humanoid in shape, albeit with elongated limbs, claws and spikes. So after clipping away and cleaning up the parts, I assembled the left leg and lower half of the torso. While the hands were already clawed, I wanted something much more fearsome, and so dipped into the Demon Prince kit. I would source quite a few parts from this kit over the course of this build, but for now I just focused on the hands. My aim was to give the segmented fingers the appearance of bone rather than armour, and so I started out my process by clipping away the spikes from the fingers. With my Demon Prince hand prepped, the Wilderfiend hand was clipped away, cleaned up and compared against the Demon Prince hand. The wrist of the Demon Prince's hand did need to be scraped down a little in order to narrow it at the wrist and to flatten out the joint, but once I was happy with the fit, the hand and fingers were glued. The Beast of Khorne, depicted in Omens of Destruction, has much larger forearms than my Wilderfiend, as well as some armoured cuffs. To recreate both of these on my own interpretation, I took some of the armoured forearm plates from the Demon Prince kit. After a quick comparison against the left forearm, I made some trims and adjustments to help it fit better. After another comparison, I did notice quite a considerable gap. The simplest way of resolving this that I could think of was to shake the original Wilderfiend arm plate, trim it down and glue the new plate over the top. This filled in the forearm gap nicely, whilst also bulking out the arm somewhat and masking the join in the hand. With the arm complete, I glued it to the rest of the torso and continued to assemble. But before I built the right half of the model, I first needed to tackle the head. Once again, the Demon Prince kit provided me with the ideal Khornate head. I did toy with the idea of using an Ogroid Myrmidon head instead, as a result would have been quite similar, but I ultimately settled on this one. While the head was a good pick, it did need some adjustments. First, I assembled the head without the horns, as I planned on replacing them with the much larger horns that came with the Wilderfiend kit. In order to attach these, I first clipped away each horn from the central spine, before then flattening out both the base of the horns and the Demon Prince's head, making frequent comparisons as I did so. Once they were lining up, the horns were glued into place. My next task was to attach this new head to the existing neck without impacting the overall pose of the model. Once again, I resolved this by making a few quick cuts with my clippers, followed by a gradual process of comparison and adjustment until I was able to glue the new head into place. I then followed this by also assembling the right leg and the right side of the torso. For the right arm, my process was pretty much a repeat of the left arm. The main deviation came though in how I attached the hand. Rather than reproducing the vertically held hand, I instead attached my Demon Prince hand at a right angle to the arm, making the required trims to allow this to sit properly. With the arm attached to the torso, my second wrist plate was glued over the top. My final Khorne Demon Prince piece was for the tip of the tail. All that I needed to do here was to clip away the tip of the Wilderfiend's tail, glue the Demon Prince's spiky tail end to it, and then attach everything to the torso. Which I followed with the loincloth and some trophies, but not before removing the small square tab that jutted from the belt. By this stage, my Beast of Khorne was getting fairly close to the ones in Total War, but I was lacking one key detail: fur, and lots of it. To recreate this, I turned to my trusty green stuff. After mixing up a fresh batch, I began a slow, iterative process of building up the fur across the beast's back, neck, and shoulders. I began at the bottom of the back, applied a small lump, and scoured in a few squiggly lines. I then broke these longer lines up into separate, shorter strands. Once one patch was complete, I repeated the same process on another patch. As I built up these patches, I made sure to overlap them in order to help build up the thickness of the fur, as it can be quite easy to create a rather flat looking fur. During this entire process, I did make sure to keep my fingers and tools coated in a very small amount of Vaseline. It just helps to smooth out the sculpting and prevent it from sticking to everything other than the model itself. After building up the fur across the model, including across the chest and around the groin, I then went back to a few patches and added more fur over the top. Again, this just helped to create a much denser, more matted looking fur, and bring my miniature closer to the Khorne beasts from the game. While the green stuff was being left to cure, I then set about assembling the rocks from the Wilderfiend kit. It seemed a shame to not use these, as they did give the model a much more imposing stature. However, by switching out the hands, I had caused the beast's right hand to sit much too high above the rocks rather than resting on them. Fortunately, my Dead Animal Bits kit was able to save the day by giving me this huge beastly rib cage to bridge the gap. After a quick dry fit, the rib cage was glued to the hand, but I kept the beast separate from the rocks for now. All that was left to do then was to attach another Dead Animal Bits bone to the rocks, glue the rocks to the base, and then attach the Wilderfiend to a temporary, smaller base to make painting it much easier. But before we get onto the painting, let's take another look at the sponsors of this video, Omens of Destruction for Total War Warhammer 3. With it comes 15 new units, 3 legendary heroes, and 3 legendary lords, as well as new faction mechanics and campaign features. You can take control of the Man-Eaters of Goldfag and undertake mercenary contracts for other factions. Command the Orc hordes of the cunning Gorbad Ironclaw as you unleash your fiendish tactics onto enemies known as the Plan. Or spill blood in Deepest Lustria as Skulltaker, whilst empowering your Cloak of Skulls with each lord you defeat. With each of these lords comes some equally iconic units, such as the Ogre Man-Eaters, Slaughter Brutes, and best of all, the Colossal Squig, just to name a few. You can pick up each of these factions individually or as a bundle for a discount. Use my link down in the description and pinned comment below, and bring the Omens of Destruction to the old world. To start the painting, I began with some Rattlecan primers, specifically Reliquary Red and Standard Grey from the Colour Forge. This red was an excellent starting point for the red flesh of the beast and saved me a lot of time over painting it on with a brush. While the red was a great starting point, I did want to build up the contrast between the shaded recessed areas and the defined details on the skin. To start this, I took some Luxion Purple contrast paint and diluted it with a little airbrush thinner. This mix was then painted directly into those recesses where the thinner helped it to flow and pool. The purple tone was just dark enough to deepen the shadows without losing the intensity of the red. To offer some contrast to the shadows, I next began the process of highlighting the skin using some Emperor Red from the Tooth and Coat range to pick out the raised details. The final step in painting the red areas of flesh was to use the even brighter Centurion Red. This was used as an extreme highlight and was used to pick out only the sharpest points of detail or where two edges met to form a corner. As I was using the Beast of Khorne from Total War as the inspiration for my colour scheme, I wanted to recreate the lighter skin tone across the front of the torso and the insides of the arms and leg. To begin, I used some Argonaut Skin and applied several thin layers to achieve some solid coverage. To help darken down these recesses, I then proceeded to apply more contrast paint, this time using some Darkoath Flesh, thinned and applied in the same way as the earlier Luxion Purple. The lighter skin tone was then highlighted first with Kronos Flesh, followed by a few small spots of Ares Flesh. For the mass of black matted fur, I started out with a base coat of Death Reaper. However, as Death Reaper is actually just a very dark grey, I was able to apply a wash of thinned Black Legion that allowed the recesses to be darkened down ever so slightly. I continued to build upon the shading with some highlights of Dungeon Stone Grey, and then some small spots of Wizard Grey. From here, I then turned my attention to the rocky outcrop. The Standard Grey primer had given me a great starting point, but with an all-over wash of Necrosis Green, I was able to create a much more realistic rock colour. To bring out that rocky texture, I used some dry brushing. After dipping my dry brush into some Wizard Grey and working the paint through the bristles, I lightly brushed the rock so that the lighter grey formed only on the raised details. I then followed this up with a lighter application and edge highlight of Carcharadon Grey. Next up were the claws on the hands and feet, as well as the teeth. For all of these, I started off with some Panzer Yellow, but I left the horns and spikes alone for the time being. This base coat was then followed up by a wash of Archaic Sepia, before I began the highlights of Flak Gun Yellow, and finally, Ivory Tusk. To paint both the hanging loincloth and the wrappings around the wrists, I began with some Scorched Earth, followed by a wash of Battle Mud, which was built upon with highlights of Ancient Forest, and then Wasteland Brown. To create a reddish-brown leather effect, I opted to start with a base coat of Cuirass Leather. Now, Cuirass Leather is a little darker than the previous Scorched Earth, so I gave it a coat of the darker Oblivion Black. Before continuing with the red leather effect, my next step was to highlight with some Boar Hide, and then with some small spots of Fur Cloak. From here, I could finally turn my attention to the horns, spikes, and various bones scattered across the model. All of these were given a starting coat of Dust Bowl. They were then darkened down with a little wash of Battle Mud. For the highlights, I first started off with some Sandstone, with a few small dots of Temple Stone being added as an extreme highlight. Next up, I tackled the metallics. These areas included the armoured forearms as well as a few brass rings and the cornate beard symbol. For all of these, I started out with some Spartan Bronze. For the wash, I opted to use another contrast paint, specifically some thinned Cygor Brown, which I then followed with a single highlight of Dragon's Gold. To finish off all the bronze and to give it more of a weathered effect, I targeted a little Kroxigor Scales into some of the recesses and around a few of the studs. This helped to give the metal a light, oxidized effect. One of the final areas to tackle were the severed heads on the belt. One of these I'd painted earlier using the same colours that I'd used to paint the cloth wrappings, but for the remaining head I applied a base coat of Griffon Claw, before giving it a coat of Necrosis Green, which helped to give it a decaying pallor. This was then further emphasised with a highlight of the pale tan of Ivory Tusk. With the model itself complete, I returned to the base. The remaining gaps around the rock pile were then filled in with some of AK Interactive's Dark Earth texture paste. This is a thick texture mix which, when dried, replicates the appearance of Earth. This can take a little while to dry though, so maybe wait a few hours before continuing. I then picked out that raised texture of the Earth with an initial dry brush of Dust Bowl, followed by some Sandstone, which I focused mainly on the outer rim of the base. Now that everything had been painted, I could give both the model and the base a coat of matte varnish. I applied this via my airbrush, but you could use a regular rattle can varnish instead. With the paintwork protected and the glossiness reduced, I then removed the beast from its temporary base, cleaned up the contact points with my knife, and then glued the model back together. Now, I could have called the model done right here, but what kind of blood beast would it be without some sort of blood effects? To create the appearance of gore and viscera stringing between the claws, I grabbed a little Yoo-hoo glue and used a little wire to help me wrap the strings of glue between the fingertips and across the base's ribcage. After allowing the strings of glue to dry, I created a blood mixture of gloss varnish and Blood Angel's Red contrast paint. I added just a drop of Black Legion as well, just to help darken the red a little. I then painted this mixture across all of those strands, helping to transform them into stringy strips of blood and viscera. In addition to painting the strands, I also focused my applications around the rocks and claws, helping to give the impression of blood dripping onto the ground beneath the beast. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have my completed Beast of Khorne, inspired by its namesake featured in the Omens of Destruction DLC. While I had a good basis in which to build my beast around, I still tried to make my model my own. I originally wanted to recreate the bulky Khorne gorilla look of the games version, but once I'd had the idea of using the Wilderfiend, I really liked the more elongated, stringy appearance that I was left with. But how would you field something like this on the tabletop? Well, the base and model itself are very similar in size to the Demon Prince, so it would be very easy to proxy him as one. I think he'd work particularly well alongside Darkoath forces in a Slaves to Darkness force. Now, as always, if you have any suggestions for future kit bashes you'd like to see me tackle, then please do let me know in the comments down below. And if you'd like to recreate this build, I will include all the links to every kit and paint that I used in this video down in the description below, including where you can pick up my very own Dead Animal Bits kit. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep this channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Axel Jonsson, Ban Jevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Older Than Time, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Samuel Sepulveda, Sweaterman, Tim, and War Novice. And my top channel members who are Alex Verne, Dave, Doug H, Guy Bazant, Coach Cato, Mark Taylor, Nerdington Paints, Omni Tom, Philip Poya, SO, That One Tech Priest, The City of Cryas, The Sire Acquired, Trooper Geo, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.